Nigerian President Tinubu looked Ibrahim Traoré in the eye and told him to resign, claiming it was for Africa's stability. But what happened next didn't just shake the summit, it froze the room, made some leaders walk out, and lit a fire still burning across Africa today. What would you do if the most powerful people in the room told you to step aside? Would you stay silent or speak a truth they didn't want to hear? And if you did, could you handle the silence that followed? Because in the next few minutes, you'll hear exactly how Traoré answered, and why his words turned from speech into a movement. So don't blink, because every second counts. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and hit subscribe so you never miss the stories the news won't show you. In front of hundreds of world leaders, seated under the cold glow of global power, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu leaned into the microphone. He didn't raise his voice, but his words thundered through the conference hall. For the sake of Africa's stability, Captain Ibrahim Traoré should consider stepping down. The room froze. A few gasps slipped out. Some journalists turned to each other, eyes wide. Others began scribbling feverishly. The cameras locked onto Traoré. His posture didn't shift. No blink, no breath, just silence. But inside him, the ground was shifting. What does a man carry when the whole world waits for his next breath? And what he said next would not only silence that room, it would reverberate across a continent longing for truth. At that very moment, something uncanny happened. Even the overhead lights seemed to hesitate, casting sharp lines across Traoré's face like the bars of a prison. Except this was no jail. This was Washington D.C. The 2025 spring meetings of the IMF and World Bank. Delegates from over 150 nations. Billions in aid on the table. And one African leader being asked, on global television, to step down. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't glance at the translator. He understood perfectly. And still, he remained motionless. Tinubu's voice echoed once more in the stunned silence. This is not an attack. It is a plea. Our continent needs unity, not defiance. A few scattered nods. Someone in a navy suit whispered, "That took guts." But then, the microphone in front of Traoré flicked on with a quiet click. His voice entered the room like a calm wind before a sandstorm. "Mr. President," he began, his tone even, almost gentle, "if stability means obedience to interests outside our soil, then maybe what we need isn't stability, but truth." A hush swept through the crowd. The World Bank chair shifted in her seat. An IMF representative paused mid-sip of coffee. "I am not here because I campaigned," Traoré continued. "I am here because my people were dying, and no one listened, until we stopped asking for permission." A large screen behind him displayed the image of a dry well in Djibo. "This is what we call reform," he said. "And for this you suggest I resign?" His eyes didn't leave Tinubu's. The tension between them wasn't political, it was generational, philosophical. One man led through diplomacy and debt, the other through fire and dust. But which legacy lasts longer in the memory of a wounded continent? "Tell me," Traoré asked, his voice now sharper, "when you speak of African unity, is that unity purchased with foreign contracts or earned through sweat and sacrifice?" A few seats back, the Namibian minister coughed awkwardly. The Ghanaian delegate stared at her shoes, but a young aide from Chad silently raised her phone to capture the moment. In Ouagadougou, the broadcast flickered into village homes. Farmers stopped eating, mothers called their children over. "Shh, it's him," one whispered. Back in the hall, Tinubu adjusted his glasses. "Captain Traoré," he replied carefully, "I do not question your heart, but Africa is bleeding, and bleeding nations need surgeons, not swords." The metaphor hung awkwardly in the air. Traoré didn't smile. "Then let us be clear," he said. "Who is holding the knife?" And with that, he reached into his jacket and placed something on the desk before him, a folded letter, yellowed at the edges, dated 1 year prior. "This is my resignation letter," he said. "I wrote it in silence, on a night when I buried 6 soldiers with my own hands, but I never sent it." Then he paused. "You know why?" His voice cracked for just a second. Because a child in the Sahel gave me her last cup of water. He took a breath. She said, "Don't quit. You still fight for us." The hall wasn't breathing anymore, just watching, listening. Some skeptical, some shaken, others quietly moved. What kind of leader becomes a vessel for the hopes of the dying? Then Traoré said, "You asked me to resign for peace. But peace built on obedience is not peace. It's control." A burst of clapping came from the African youth delegation in the upper rows. Security glanced around nervously. Tinubu exhaled slowly, then leaned back. "You've made your point," he murmured. Traoré nodded. "I haven't made my point," he said. "I've made my stand." The screen behind him switched again. This time, images of schools, irrigation systems, village power grids, all built in just 18 months without IMF loans. He looked at the world. "If that threatens you," he said, "maybe it's not me who should step down." And just like that, the room changed. Eyes looked inward. Power shifted subtly but permanently. What happens when one man's defiance exposes the fragility of an entire system? The story had only just begun. The moment Tinubu's words landed, the room shifted. Cameras moved subtly to capture any twitch in Traoré's expression. But the captain didn't blink. He didn't move. Only his eyes stirred. Dark, steady, unflinching. And deep inside them, a storm churned. Not of anger, not even pride, but memory. Long, painful memory. He wasn't standing in Washington anymore. He was back in the Sahel. The heat there didn't come from lights and microphones. It came from the sun, scorching cracked red earth. He saw himself younger, standing barefoot among the dead. A convoy ambushed, his men torn by bullets, blood sinking into dry soil faster than rain ever did. He saw Private Kader, just 19, whispering, "Tell my mother I fought for her." He remembered digging graves with a rifle in one hand and a shovel in the other. They had no body bags, no ceremony, only dust and duty. And he saw the children. Always the children. Digging holes with cups, with spoons, with bare hands. Hoping water would rise where no well had been built. One little girl had looked up at him once. Her name was Samira. Her hands were covered in sand, her mouth cracked from thirst, her voice barely a whisper. "You're the captain," she said. "Can you make the sky cry for us?" He hadn't answered. He had no power over clouds. But he made a vow that day, kneeling in front of her. "If I fall, let it be for my people, never for their applause." The memory flickered out like a match in the wind. Traoré's eyes returned to the present. Tinubu's final words still hung in the air. "Africa's stability," he'd said. A phrase that sounded rehearsed, polished, dipped in diplomacy, but empty of the weight that soldiers carry and farmers bury. Across the room, leaders waited for Traoré to respond, but he didn't speak, not yet. Instead, he stood, slowly, deliberately. His chair slid back with a quiet scrape, but to the room, it sounded like thunder. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't clear his throat. He simply rose. And the world took notice. Tinubu glanced sideways, slightly caught off guard. The chair of the African Development Bank leaned forward. A young woman from South Sudan placed her hand over her heart. Journalists lifted their pens. The silence stretched thin. Traoré rested his palms on the table before him. His fingertips touched the resignation letter he had revealed moments earlier. He didn't unfold it. He didn't need to. Its meaning already pierced the room. This wasn't about stepping down. It was about standing up. "I remember," he began, voice low but unshakable, "when the only stability my people knew was the stability of poverty." His eyes swept across the room. "When international institutions told us to wait, when they said help is coming, but help never came, so we helped ourselves." No reaction, just breathing. Careful, slow breathing. "I was told once," he continued, "that a real leader knows when to walk away. But I ask you, walk away from what? From children who sleep with hunger, from elders who sell the little they have to buy medicine you priced in foreign currencies, from lands that bleed gold but bury their people in debt." He paused. "No, I will not walk away. Not when we've just started to walk on our own." Someone at the back tried to interrupt. He raised a finger, not to silence, but to continue. Leadership, he said, is not about sitting in polished rooms or shaking hands under expensive lights. It is about who you answer to. And I answer to mothers who've lost sons, to children who've never tasted clean water, to a country that buried hope for decades and is now daring to resurrect it. The crowd was still. Even the translators paused, moved by the rawness of his cadence. You say I should resign for the continent's stability, Traoré said. But let me tell you something I've learned from death and drought. Stability isn't peace. It's just quiet. And quiet is not freedom when it's built on fear. What would you choose? Stability that silences truth or the storm that brings justice? Comment Amen if you believe in Traoré. Now murmurs began, first behind cameras, then in rows of delegates. Some whispered in support, others in discomfort. Tinubu remained seated, lips tight. I was not made in marble halls, Traoré continued. I was forged in heat and hunger, in failed states, in forgotten villages. I am not perfect, I am not polished, but I am present, I am here. And I will not be moved by fear disguised as diplomacy. He looked directly at Tinubu now, not with disrespect, but with truth. If we disagree, let us disagree as men who carry the weight of millions, not as pawns on a borrowed board. I welcome dialogue, but not demands, not in front of the world, not like this. Then he sat calmly. No applause followed, only the quiet sound of a man reclaiming silence, and that silence began to echo. Traoré remained standing. The room had stilled into a frozen quiet that felt like glass. Any sudden word could shatter it. His voice came slow, steady, deliberate. But it didn't need to be loud. It was the kind of voice that carried weight. Not from volume, but from truth carved through pain. I was not voted in by lobbyists, he said, his hands clasped gently before him. I was raised up by mothers who buried sons. There was no tremor in his tone, but his words reached deep into the hall, like a drumbeat heard beneath the floor. No one spoke. Some barely breathed. A few African ministers looked down at their papers, unsure where to place their eyes. On the main screen behind him, the Burkina Faso flag swayed softly, and beneath it, in simple font, his name. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. No title, no fancy embellishment. Just a name he never asked for, and a duty that never asked permission. If that offends your idea of stability, he continued, turning his head just enough to scan the room, perhaps your stability was built on silence. He paused, letting the air feel it. And it did. A rustle in the back. A soft clearing of the throat by a Western delegate. But no one counted him. Not yet. Traoré stepped slightly forward away from the microphone. But somehow his presence grew larger. I did not wake up one day and declare myself leader, he said. I stepped into a void left by years of neglect, a void shaped by aid that never arrived, by promises that came with strings thick as chains. My country did not choose me out of luxury, they chose me out of necessity. He let that sink in. There are those who sit in this room, he said, gesturing faintly, who were educated in Paris, London, New York, who speak of democracy but fund coups, who speak of partnership, but write contracts in languages no farmer in Africa speaks, and you question my legitimacy? A Nigerian delegate shifted uncomfortably. The Ghanaian ambassador scribbled something onto a notepad. The South African representative looked up. For the first time. My legitimacy, Traoré said, his voice growing firmer now, does not come from ballots counted in errand-conditioned rooms. It comes from funerals, from mothers who call my name, not with joy but with grief, because I am all that is left standing between their children and the next forgotten massacre. He wasn't grandstanding, he wasn't angry, but the room could feel the difference between performance and pain. There was no coronation, he said. There were only towns burning. There were no press releases, only whispers in the dark. Captain, will you stand with us? He took a breath. And I did. He walked slowly to the edge of the table. Tinubu was still seated, arms crossed, But his eyes were no longer defiant. They were locked on Traoré's face, reading every line like a story he'd never dared to tell himself. "You speak of African unity," Traoré said directly to him. "But whose unity is it when it erases the voice of those who never got to speak? Is it unity when the farmer in Fioma still waits for rain, while IMF loans pay for air-conditioned summits?" There were murmurs now, not outrage, just discomfort. Because some truths don't cause outrage. They cause shame, the kind that sits deep and lingers. He turned his gaze across the European and American delegates seated to his right. "To our international partners," he said, voice steady, deliberate, "I do not ask for permission to protect my people. I do not seek your applause. I ask only that you understand I did not come here to be accepted. I came here because silence was no longer an option." An older woman in the Nordic delegation lowered her eyes. A younger man near her whispered, "This is history." But what kind of history will they choose to remember? One of courage or of silence? Traoré stepped back toward the mic. "I do not carry a name chosen in elections," he said again. "I carry a name called out by survivors. I do not wear medals, I wear the weight of the fallen." How many leaders can say the same and mean it? So if that disqualifies me from your tables, then build a new table. Because I'm not stepping down. He looked around once more. Not today, not tomorrow, not while one village still waits for water, not while one mother still mourns a son killed by terrorists armed with weapons you sold, not while dignity is still treated as a luxury Africa cannot afford. The words hung there, naked, undeniable, unafraid, and still no one dared interrupt. A silence, thicker than before, stretched into every seat, every camera lens, every interpreter's booth, and then quietly, almost imperceptibly, a young delegate from Kenya placed her hand to her chest. Beside her, a representative from Niger nodded softly. They said nothing, but the look in their eyes said enough. This wasn't just Trey's stand, it was theirs too. Isn't that how change begins, with one voice, then two, then a room that forgets how to look away? The cameras, though fixed to appear neutral, had already begun their subtle betrayals. They scanned the crowd of dark suits and controlled faces, but one by one they caught the smallest cracks. A cough, a downward glance, the shifting of legs, a tightened jaw. At the IMF table, a senior executive gently adjusted her earpiece, but she couldn't hide the look in her eyes. Unreadable to some, but unmistakable to those who knew shame when they saw it. Her colleague beside her tapped a pen against his notepad. He avoided the screen entirely as Traoré's words echoed through the hall like a slow-burning indictment. Traoré stood alone, but he didn't sound alone. His words had broken the thin illusion that this was just another polite summit, filled with predictable platitudes. This wasn't policy talk. It was a reckoning. Tinubu, still seated across the platform, received a folded note from his advisor. He didn't open it right away. His gaze remained fixed on the figure before him. Young, armored in plain fabric. And truth, unmoved by hierarchy. The audience felt it too. A quiet unease crawled into the corners of the room, because they all knew what sat beneath the polished speeches and professional smiles. They knew the deals inked behind closed doors. They knew the truth, hidden beneath acronyms and talking points. They knew about the money behind the microphones. For years, institutions had spoken of development aid and stability packages. But what they rarely mentioned were the interest rates that followed, or the mineral rights forfeited, or the young farmers pushed off their land to make room for global investors. What they didn't say out loud was that African sovereignty had a price tag. And it was often signed in dollars, euros, and silence. How many times can dignity be traded before a continent forgets what it looks like? Now, as Traoré stood defiantly against a demand dressed as diplomacy, something cracked beyond the walls of the conference center. On the streets of Dar, youth began gathering in internet cafes. Phones pointed at live streams. In Lusaka, student unions watching the feed erupted with emotion. In Lagos, young Nigerians whispered, some with shame, some with admiration, as the hashtag lit up their screens. Hashtag We Stand with Traoré. It spread faster than anyone in the building could imagine. TikTok edits of his speech were already climbing in views. Memes of Tinubu looking stunned flooded WhatsApp groups. Instagram Reels cut his line about mothers who buried sons over cinematic music. But this wasn't performative. It was personal. Because for many across the continent, Traoré wasn't just a president. He was what they had been asking for in the dark, without even knowing the shape of the answer. Someone who didn't just wear their pain as talking points, but as scars. Inside the summit hall, a communications officer rushed toward a media coordinator from the World Bank. "Sir, Twitter's trending list." "Traoré is #1 globally," she whispered. "The room's reacting, but the internet's exploding." He looked up, confused. "How fast?" She showed him the screen. Over 4 million tweets in just 1 hour. He exhaled. "That's not just support, that's a storm." Meanwhile, the broadcast team tried to reframe the narrative. They cut to a wide shot, pulled back the camera, replaced the close-up of Tinubu's reaction with a generic view of the stage. But it was too late. The world had already seen. The words were already out. They had traveled beyond borders, beyond spin rooms, beyond diplomatic language. They had entered the bloodstream of the people. Back on stage, Tinubu finally opened the note. A short message from his advisor: "Step lightly. The room is shifting." He folded it quietly. His face showed nothing. But in his gut, he knew. This wasn't just an uncomfortable speech. This was a moment, and it would outlive all of them. Traoré remained composed. His gaze now turned toward the senior figures at the IMF table. "How many loans," he asked calmly, "were approved with signatures from people who had never set foot in the villages they claimed to help? How many reports listed progress while my people stood in food lines?" No one answered. Not because they couldn't, but because any answer would only confirm what the silence already screamed. "The world does not need to save Africa," he said. "Africa needs the world to stop selling her pieces back to herself. Let us keep what is ours and give what we choose to give, not what we are forced to surrender in exchange for our dignity." There it was. Not shouted, not roared, just spoken like a truth carved over years of watching promises melt in the heat of African sun. The translator's voice broke slightly while repeating his words in French. Her hands trembled as she held the page. Because even she, trained for neutrality, felt something shift in her chest. Across the sea of dignitaries, only a few could meet Traoré's eyes now. The rest busied themselves with notes, screens, cups of water, anything to avoid what his words had turned into a mirror. And then, as if summoned by the force of collective emotion, a soft sound emerged. A single clap, slow, rhythmic, coming from the youth gallery above. A delegate from Mali, then another from Zimbabwe, then one from the Gambia, clapping not for show, but for something they had never witnessed at that level. Someone speaking not to power, but through it. The applause didn't spread far, but it didn't need to. Impact doesn't always come in volume, it comes in weight. And this moment had already crossed oceans. It wasn't applause that mattered now. It was the recognition that the narrative had shifted, and no amount of money behind any microphone could pull it back. Traoré let the room settle into silence again, as if he understood the weight of what had just been said, and knew that silence, real silence, was sometimes louder than applause. Then he leaned slightly forward, his voice lowering, drawing the room closer without raising the volume. "There is a name I want to share with you," he said. "Not of a leader, not of a general, not of a diplomat or financier." He looked slowly across the rows of faces before him. Her name was Halima. He paused, and the room held its breath. She was 10 years old, lived in a village near Gorum, a place you'll never see in your glossy pamphlets. No roads, no schools, no electricity, just dust, wind, and survival. He didn't flinch. 2 weeks ago, she died. Not from war, not from violence, from thirst. No one spoke. A few lowered their eyes. One delegate reached quietly for a pen, then set it down without writing. Her mother had walked 20 kilometers searching for water. The well had dried. The river was gone. They dug with bowls, with fingernails, with whatever strength they had left. His words came not as performance, but as testimony. Halima's last words were not about fear or pain, he said. She looked up at her mother and whispered, "Will the captain come?" His voice cracked just for a moment, then recovered. "She didn't ask me to resign. She asked me to build a well." A hush deeper than before swept over the room. There were no whispers now, no coughs, just the heavy stillness of truth. "I never met her," Traoré continued, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. "But I have met hundreds like her, children with hollow cheeks and burning eyes. They don't care for power games. They don't know the names of the IMF or G7. They know hunger. They know thirst. And they know promises that never come. How many times must children wait before someone stops waiting for permission to act?" On the far side of the room, a Western delegate, a woman in her 60s with grey-streaked hair and a blue silk scarf, reached into her jacket pocket. She wiped a single tear from beneath her glasses. She wasn't the only one holding something back. The truth had cut through the layers of politics and protocol and pierced something raw. Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "When people tell me to step down for the sake of peace," he said, setting his tone slow and deliberate, "I wonder if they've ever sat by a grave that was dug too early. I wonder if they've ever watched a child die. Not because of a disease, but because no one thought her life was profitable enough to matter." He stepped forward just slightly. "We had funds to build a well," he said. "It was delayed by bureaucracy. Negotiations, loan terms, development priorities," they said. He let that phrase hang in the air, almost bitterly. "We buried her before the money arrived." The air in the hall had shifted. What began as a public forum now felt like a courtroom, and Traoré was not on trial. He was the witness. "I carry her face with me," he said, "not in a photo, in my memory. And it reminds me every morning why I rise, why I stand, why I refuse to step aside." A diplomat from Kenya nodded slowly, hands folded in his lap. A few seats away, a young South African advisor tapped something quietly into her phone. "Halima, never forget her." "I don't seek pity," Traoré added, "and I don't want your tears. I want you to understand. This continent is bleeding, quietly. And when we are told to keep smiling, to keep begging, to stay in line for the sake of stability, what we're really being asked is to keep burying our children in silence." He turned his attention to the giant screen, now displaying abstract development charts and statistics. "This screen won't show you Halima," he said, "but I will." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and opened it slowly. It was a drawing, a simple one. Crayons on scrap paper, a stick figure beside what looked like a round circle. "She drew this 2 days before she died," he said. "It's me next to a well. She imagined we'd build. She believed the captain would come. She believed someone would listen." The room remained frozen. He placed the drawing gently on the podium. "I didn't come here to win arguments," he said, almost softly now. "I came to speak for the ones who are never invited into these halls, the ones who die waiting for policy to turn into action." Another beat of silence. He looked at Tinubu again, but this time, not with confrontation. It was something else, a kind of sorrow, or perhaps a plea. "You asked me to resign, and I ask you, all of you, what would you resign from if your people were still dying from responsibility, from truth, from love?" He shook his head. "I cannot." He stepped back, his hands at his side, the folded drawing still visible. And the silence in the room was no longer awkward or political. It was grief. Grief born not from spectacle, but from a 10-year-old girl whose name none of them would forget. Tinubu adjusted his seat, finally breaking his stillness. The applause had stopped long ago, but now his fingers tapped once on the desk before him. And when he rose, the room responded with a ripple of movement. Delegates turned, advisors leaned in. The president of Nigeria had remained measured, until now, but something in his posture had shifted. He stepped forward, speaking without paper, without prompt, and with a voice that sought to reassert the room's attention. Leadership, he began, pausing just long enough for emphasis, is not defiance. His eyes narrowed, gaze locked on Traoré. Leadership is diplomacy. There it was, the framing, the shift, the return to order. What you are building, he said louder, drawing a murmur from the audience, is not reform. It is rebellion. He raised his hand slightly, as if to press the weight of his words into the air itself. We are gathered here to move Africa forward, not to tear down what little structure we've managed to build together. From the far side of the hall came the sound of chairs shifting, a few hands clapping, mostly from the European rows. A Canadian diplomat nodded approvingly. The US envoy gave a tight smile. They heard familiar music in Tinubu's words, the cadence of cooperation, the rhythm of restraint. Tinubu went on. I understand the passion, Captain. I too have walked roads cracked by drought. I too have met mothers with grief in their eyes. But I chose the path of diplomacy, not defiance, because without structure there is only chaos, and Africa, he said, voice rising again, has had enough chaos. A burst of applause came, this time not hesitant, but assertive. Tinubu stood squarely in the center of the stage. Back straight, chin lifted. He wasn't simply responding. He was re-establishing authority. The seasoned statesman reminding the room that while emotion may stir the people, policy builds the future. But Traoré didn't move. He didn't blink. His expression didn't change. And in that stillness, there was more resistance than in any shouted reply. Tinubu stepped closer to the front row. This is not a time for lone soldiers, he declared. This is a time for unity, a time for alliance, a time to sit at the table with those who fund our progress and negotiate, not to shame them with speeches that may win headlines but lose long-term trust. Another wave of light applause followed, this time from AU officials known for conservative diplomacy. The applause, however, did not reach the African youth delegates seated in the upper rows. They remained motionless, arms folded, eyes locked on Traoré. Your passion is noted, Tinubu continued, softening his tone. But passion without plan is perilous. We need blueprints, not battles. We need order, not outrage. We need... Traoré raised his hand slightly, just enough to pause Tinubu in mid-sentence. Not to interrupt, but to reclaim space. The Nigerian president froze for a beat, then stepped back, signaling he was done. He had delivered his second shot, carefully worded, visibly supported by parts of the room, applauded by many in the West. And yet, Traoré remained still, a mountain unmoved by wind. The room waited, the camera lingered. No one knew what would come next. But everyone knew one thing for sure. He was not going to flinch. Traoré stood motionless, absorbing the full force of Tinubu's words, the scattered applause, and the eyes now pressing into him like a second wall. But he didn't speak immediately. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded, weathered sheet of paper. The motion was small, but the attention in the room snapped toward it like metal to a magnet. The paper wasn't pristine. It had been handled many times, the creases soft from wear. He didn't unfold it right away. He simply held it there, letting its presence speak. This, he said quietly, is a letter I wrote exactly 1 year ago. I never showed it to anyone. Not my cabinet, not my commanders, not even my family. He paused, and the silence grew deeper. It's a resignation letter, he said. A faint murmur swept the room like wind through dry grass. Traoré let it pass before continuing. Yes, he admitted, eyes now sweeping the room. I once considered quitting. He unfolded the page gently, holding it with care, as if it still carried the weight of that moment. The ink had faded in places. There were smudges along the margin, fingerprints stained with earth. He held it up just long enough for the cameras to catch the date, 12 months ago, written in his own hand. There was a night, he said, voice even, when I stood at a mass grave. I had buried more men than I could count. Their names are not in your press releases. Their faces will never be printed in textbooks. But I knew them. They were fathers, sons, brothers. We had eaten together, bled together, and now they lay side by side in the dirt, shot, forgotten, nameless in the eyes of those who speak of security partnerships. A stillness fell so complete that even the background hum of machinery seemed to disappear. I was exhausted, he continued. I hadn't slept in days. My hands were trembling. My chest ached. I felt, how do you say it in diplomacy, defeated. He allowed himself a breath. And so I wrote this, a letter to step down, to disappear, to walk away. He lowered the letter to his side, but I didn't send it. He stepped forward now, closer to the edge of the stage, his voice gaining a quiet strength. Because the next morning, I met a boy. He was barefoot. His shirt was torn, his knees were scraped. He must have been 7, maybe 8. He walked right up to me and said, "Captain, are you going to fix the well?" Traoré smiled faintly, just for a second. I asked him why he wasn't in school. He said, "School's closed, but Mama says you'll open it again." I looked at his feet, calloused, blistered. He had walked 4 miles just to ask that question, and then he handed me something. A rock, just an ordinary stone. But he said, "This is to remember. Don't forget us." The audience leaned in. Even Tinubu's expression softened. His jaw no longer clenched. That boy didn't ask for statistics. He didn't ask for budgets or policies or summits. He asked for a well, for a school, for a future. Traoré held up the letter again, this time higher. I kept this not as a symbol of weakness, but as proof that I too have doubted, that I too have been broken, that I too have stood right at the edge of surrender. He paused. But leadership is not the absence of doubt. It's what you do after you've tasted it. He let the letter fall gently onto the podium. I'm not ashamed that I wrote it. I'm proud I never sent it. Now he looked directly at Tinubu, not with defiance, but with humanity. You say I'm building rebellion, but I say I'm building memory. I'm building dignity. I'm building the kind of courage that a boy with no shoes handed to me in the shape of a rock. He reached into his pocket again and placed a small, smooth stone beside the letter. I carry this with me every day, he said, not as a token, but as a promise. Across the room, even the previously composed European delegates sat quietly, no longer checking their notes. One whispered to another, "That's not strategy, that's soul." Traoré stepped back from the podium. "You asked me to step down for the sake of unity," he said. "But unity built on silence is just a shared lie. If I must be the voice that disrupts your comfort so that others may one day speak without fear, then I accept that burden." He turned back toward the screen where his name still hovered above the flag. "My name," he said finally, "was once almost erased by this letter. But now let it be remembered, not for how close I came to quitting, but for why I never did." And then he said no more. In Ouagadougou, the capital of a nation often spoken about but rarely heard, life had not stopped. But it had slowed. Shops remained open, but the radios were louder than the vendors. In the dusty courtyards, children stopped chasing each other. At cafes and corner stands, the usual clatter of conversation gave way to quiet tension, as if everyone knew that history might be shifting in that very moment. Every screen, every speaker, every pair of working ears turned toward the live summit broadcast. Traoré's voice was being carried not just through fiber optic cables, but through the breath of his people. At a crowded market near the central mosque, an old woman stood still in the middle of the vegetable stalls. Her hands, worn and calloused from decades of labor, slowly came together in prayer. She didn't speak loudly. Her voice was barely audible beneath the crackling radio, but those beside her heard the words clear as a bell. "Don't let them break him," she whispered. Beside her, her son, tall, silent, dressed in a faded shirt with dust on his sleeves, did not look at her as he answered. His eyes remained fixed on the small TV mounted above a fruit stand where Traoré's face was frozen mid-sentence. "They can't," he said calmly. "He's already broken for us." People didn't cheer, they didn't clap. They listened, because in Burkina Faso, where stories were passed down through whispers, through sweat, through funerals and fields, they didn't need spectacle, they needed presence. And Traoré had never stopped being present. At a school just outside the city, students gathered in a computer lab not yet finished, wires still dangling from the ceiling. A teacher had pushed the desks into rows and turned the projector toward the wall. On screen, their president stood steady against the most powerful room in the world. A girl in the front row whispered to her friend, "He looks like my uncle." Her friend replied softly, "No, he looks like all of us." In a mechanic's garage, a group of young men wiped grease from their hands and stared at a smartphone balanced between two car batteries. When Traoré unfolded the resignation letter, one of them muttered under his breath, "I would have left." Another shook his head. "That's why you're not him." At a clinic in the north, where electricity flickered with every gust of wind, a nurse stood with her stethoscope still around her neck. A mother was sobbing softly in the next room. The IV for her child had just stopped dripping. Yet even here, in the thick of pain, they listened. One of the nurses whispered, "He speaks like he knows us." And another, older than the rest, said, "He is us." Across the country, in towns without paved roads, in homes built with earth and love, there was no debate about diplomacy. They weren't discussing trade agreements or international relations. They were listening for one thing, almost holding their breath, as if the entire nation wanted to catch a truth before it could be taken away. Because for so long, Burkina Faso had been treated like a statistic, one more struggling nation in the heart of the Sahel, known more for its troubles than its triumphs. But now their leader was standing not just on the global stage, but inside their living rooms, their silence, their hopes. In a village where the well had just begun to refill, thanks to a pipeline funded not by foreign aid, but by local effort, a father placed his radio on the center of the table and motioned for his family to be quiet. When Trey spoke of Halima, the room fell into sacred stillness. His wife's eyes filled. His teenage son clenched his jaw. They didn't say much, but when the president placed that crumpled letter on the podium and laid down the stone from the boy with no shoes, the father stood. He walked outside, looked at the sky, and said to no one in particular, "We will not lose him." In the south, a pastor ended his morning sermon early and invited the congregation to sit on the floor around a projector connected to a diesel generator. He knelt with them. When Traoré told the summit that silence is not unity, the pastor closed his eyes and whispered, "Amen." In the very village where Traoré was born, a few elders sat under a neem tree, listening on an old shortwave radio. They knew him not as the captain or the president, but as the boy who once carried water before sunrise, who studied with a candle, who watched his father weep when the crops failed. One of the elders turned to another. "He carries the weight of the dead," he said. "That's why the living still follow him." Everywhere they listened. They listened not because they were told to, but because the voice on the screen didn't sound like politics. It sounded like memory, like the sound of dry earth cracking open when the rain finally comes. And though the world might measure progress in GDP, in votes, in applause, the people of Burkina Faso measured it in something quieter, in whether they still believed, and in whether that belief could survive another storm. And in that moment, watching Traoré stand alone, yet not alone, they did. Traoré turned slowly toward President Tinubu, the light from the overhead fixtures casting sharp shadows across his face. His posture remained composed, but there was a quiet thunder building behind his eyes. He wasn't done. He had stood through applause and silence, had spoken of graves and promises, but now he turned his words like a blade toward the one who first asked him to step down. "Your Excellency," he said, his voice low, measured, but unmistakably sharp. "You spoke of stability." The word hung in the air almost like a taunt. And somewhere in that pause, you could feel the question forming, not just for Tinubu, but for every leader in the room. What exactly have we been defending all these years? So, let me ask you, what kind of stability are you referring to? He paused, not to search for the next words, but to let the silence do part of the speaking. Then he continued, each syllable deliberate. The stability bought in oil contracts or the one paid for by blood. The room froze. There was no immediate reaction, just a silence that felt like pressure, like altitude, like a room realizing it had been exposed. A few delegates glanced toward Tinubu, waiting for his response. Others stared at their tablets, their shoes, the nameplates in front of them, anywhere but at the man who had just cracked the summit's facade. A delegate from Mozambique coughed and looked down. The Tunisian ambassador shifted in his seat. Even the interpreter hesitated for a split second before translating the words into French, her voice thinner than before. Tinubu didn't reply, not right away. His jaw tightened, his hands folded slowly in front of him. He blinked twice, but his face betrayed little. Yet, in that stillness, it was clear Traoré's words had landed where no applause could reach. Traoré didn't need to press the point. The room was already doing the work for him. "You speak of diplomacy," he said now, addressing the room more broadly. "You speak of cooperation, of shared values. But whose values are we talking about when oil flows freely across borders, but food does not? When minerals are exported at speed, but medicine arrives too late?" He let the questions fall like stones. "Is that the stability you protect?" Still no answer. "There are leaders in this room," he said, "who signed peace deals while their villages burned, who smiled for cameras while their children walked miles barefoot, who call for calm only after they've secured their investments. So again I ask, what does your stability cost, and who is made to pay for it?" A quiet stirred near the European delegates. A few whispered behind clasped hands. Some scrolled through phones pretending not to listen, but the words had already found them. Traoré turned his attention back to Tinubu. "Mr. President, I do not question your experience. I do not question your service, but I do question the legacy we are being asked to protect. Because if that legacy demands silence in the face of hunger, if it demands obedience while our youth drown in desperation, then it is not stability, it is suffocation." Tinubu opened his mouth briefly, but then stopped. Whatever rebuttal he had prepared was no longer enough. Across the hall, a few delegates raised their eyes timidly at first. A young minister from Sierra Leone, no older than 30, sat forward in her chair. A former diplomat from Ethiopia exchanged a glance with the AU's cultural envoy. Something was shifting. Not loudly, but definitely. "I stand here not because I desire disruption," Traoré said. "I stand because disruption already lives in our homes. It walks in the form of empty grain bags. It cries through mothers who must choose which child eats. It waits at the edge of villages for promises that never come." He returned to the central microphone, his tone now heavier with restrained fury. And in that wait, you could almost hear the unspoken question. How long can a nation endure when its people have already given more than they have left? "We have been told to be patient. We have been told that change takes time, but I have buried too many sons of Burkina Faso to believe that time will simply save us. Time doesn't heal when it's stolen." Now some heads began to nod. "We are told we must be respectable, measured, grateful, but I say respect is earned, and I will not trade dignity for a seat at a table built on exploitation." He glanced toward the Western media row where several foreign journalists sat frozen. "Write what you want," he said. "But remember this, stability that only protects investors is not peace, it's just quiet oppression." The air in the room had turned thick. No one was typing. No one moved. Then he asked one final question, so soft that it drew the whole room closer. "When the continent is stable, but our children are still dying, what have we stabilized?" No one answered, and no one needed to. Because everyone in that room knew the silence was already an answer. The silence that followed Traoré's final question was not one of dismissal. It was one of disruption. It was the kind of silence that makes people uncomfortable. Not because they disagreed, but because deep down they recognized the truth of what they had just heard. And it was in that silence that the room began to shift. Not all at once, not loudly, but it started with murmurs, tiny, quiet stirrings like wind through tall grass. A delegate from Senegal leaned toward her counterpart from the Gambia and whispered something with a furrowed brow. Across the aisle, the representative from Mali scribbled a note and passed it to the minister from Chad. The notes weren't about budgets or resolutions. They were about what had just been laid bare. Because the moment Traoré questioned the cost of stability, he didn't just call out the West, he cracked something inside the African Union itself. And then the voice came. Not from the front, Not from one of the major powers, but from the center row. Measured, calm, yet impossible to ignore. The Ethiopian minister stood up. He was older, his hair silvering, but his presence was firm. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't posture, but he looked at Tinubu, then to Traoré, and finally to the entire hall. Stability, he said, pausing just once, does not come from surrender. It comes from sovereignty. The words landed with precision, clear, sharp, and for many in the room, they struck the truth they hadn't dared speak. Half the room nodded, the other half stiffened. The South African ambassador remained still, visibly calculating the politics of a nod. The Algerian minister turned to whisper with the Libyan delegation. The Nigerian envoy looked back at Tinubu, unsure whether to align or remain silent. Traoré didn't move. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The words hadn't come from him, and that mattered. For the first time, the resistance wasn't just him against the room, it was the room beginning to look at itself. The Ethiopian continued, "We cannot define Africa's peace by the absence of noise. We must define it by the presence of dignity. And dignity," he said as he slowly sat back down, "does not arrive by bowing to foreign approval." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but it was undeniable. A wave of claps, cautious but real, echoed through the chamber. The youth delegates from Zambia and Rwanda stood up briefly to applaud before sitting back down. The applause didn't reach the front rows of the IMF, nor the representatives of the World Bank, but that didn't matter. It wasn't meant for them. Tinubu didn't rise. He remained seated, lips pressed into a firm line, the muscles in his jaw twitching as he listened. A signal aide leaned over and whispered something into his ear. Tinubu nodded barely, then waved the aide away. He knew the moment was slipping. The floor was no longer his. Across the hall, movement began. Not chaos, not uproar, but shift. A few delegates from smaller nations, Mauritania, Seals, Coros, stood and quietly made their way toward the exit, unsure where to plant their allegiance. A diplomatic withdrawal, perhaps? Others stayed but turned inward, whispering, watching, waiting to see where the tide would turn. At the back of the room, journalists were now typing furiously, "African room divided." After Traoré's speech, one draft headline read, "Another AU ministers split over vision of stability." But none of them could quite capture what was happening in real time. It wasn't just a split, it was a reckoning. A reckoning over what kind of Africa they wanted to leave behind. A young delegate from Namibia raised her hand. She didn't wait for formal recognition. She stood and spoke. "I may not have power in this room," she said, "but I have people who sent me here hoping we would stop pretending that comfort equals progress. Captain Traoré is not perfect, but neither is this room. Let us not confuse compliance with leadership." More nods. Another wave of quiet murmurs. Traoré remained standing at the edge of the platform, his hands clasped before him. His face showed no triumph, no smile, only the same stillness he had carried since the beginning. He didn't need to win the room. He only needed to speak what no one else would. The Ghanaian minister stood briefly, looked around, then sat again. The uncertainty was palpable now. Lines that had once been drawn in stone were starting to blur. And through it all, the African room, built on history, diplomacy, and difficult compromise, was no longer uniform. It was divided not by chaos, but by conscience. If you were in that room, would you stand with Traoré's defiance or side with diplomacy's caution? Share why, and comment "Africa Rise" if you believe in Africa's awakening. The room remained suspended in a delicate tension, the air thick with things left unsaid and truths freshly spoken. Traoré stood alone on the platform, but the silence no longer felt like isolation. It felt like a tension. His voice had not shaken. His stance had not shifted. And now he chose to speak not as a president, not as a soldier, but as a son of a country that had tasted both liberation and betrayal. He stepped closer to the microphone, his voice lower now, more intimate, as if he were not addressing a summit, but speaking directly to the memory of a man who once stood where he now stood. Thomas Sankara once said, "Let us dare to invent the future." He paused, letting the name sit in the room like a returning ancestor. There was no need to explain who Sankara was. Not here. His legacy lived in murals, in worn-out books, in whispered dreams across the continent. I say, Traoré continued, lifting his eyes to the crowd, let us dare to defend it. The words were soft, but their power ran deep. They weren't a slogan. They were a challenge to the room, to the continent, to history itself. For a moment, nothing moved. The room had heard Sankara's name before, countless times in speeches and declarations, but rarely with such reverence, rarely with such ownership. Sankara wasn't being quoted as a hero of the past. He was being invoked as a responsibility in the present. In the third row, a delegate from Guinea placed her hand over her mouth, blinking away emotion. Farther back, a South Sudan youth delegate stood quietly, nodding to no one but himself. The room was absorbing more than words. It was remembering something it had tried to forget. Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't call for applause. But the room, as if unable to stay still any longer, began to stir. A single clap broke the silence. Then another. Then a few more scattered, hesitant, not choreographed, but genuine. A Namibian minister, Alina Shalongo, joined in. The Rwanda delegate followed. Even a young advisor from Tanzania, seated beside a stone-faced elder, allowed herself a few claps before stopping. It wasn't unanimous. The room wasn't erupting, but something had cracked, quietly, deeply. Traoré remained motionless. He didn't bask in the moment, he didn't smirk, he didn't bow. He just stood there, letting the weight of the words settle into every seat, every earpiece, every hesitation. I stand here, he said slowly, not to revive nostalgia, but to remind us of the unfinished work. The dream Sankara carried was not assassinated. It was buried alive, in bureaucracy, in loans, in dependence dressed as partnership. But dreams, he said, do not die when we keep speaking them. A few heads turned at that. A representative from a major Western embassy shifted in his chair, lips tight. The implication was clear, but Traoré wasn't pointing fingers anymore. He was pointing forward. We, the so-called developing nations, he continued, have developed patience. We have developed resilience. We have developed miracles from nothing. Now perhaps we are ready to develop freedom. This time, the silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was listening. Listening with the kind of focus that makes one wonder, when was the last time this hall heard words without a price tag? I do not speak against my brothers here, he added, glancing toward President Bola Ahmed Tinubu and the rows of AU leaders. I speak with them, but from a place many of us have forgotten to return to, the soil. The same soil Sankara walked, bled for and believed in when it was unfashionable to do so. He placed a hand gently on the podium. This voice, he said, is not mine. It belongs to an ex-colony that has chosen not to be ex-anything anymore. Not ex-proud, not ex-free, not ex-aiming. The phrase struck like lightning. A few claps turned to full applause. Not overwhelming, but steady. The kind that builds without a cue, the kind that doesn't need approval. Even in the media gallery, some reporters paused their typing. A BBC journalist lowered his phone, simply watching. A French outlet's editor looked toward the back of the room where African youth delegates had now stood again, clapping not wildly but firmly, as if confirming, "We heard you, Traoré, let them clap." He didn't raise his hands or nod in triumph. He looked down at the floor for a second, then back at the flags hanging around the summit chamber. And, for the first time since the beginning of the speech, he smiled. Just slightly. A smile not of victory, but of return. In Lagos, beneath the rattle of generators and the thrum of late afternoon traffic, a young university student named Idris Karim sat hunched over his cracked phone screen. The Wi-Fi was unstable, the stream kept buffering, and the heat inside his hostel room was thick. But he didn't move. He was watching Traoré. Not clips, not headlines. The entire summit. Every word, every pause, every breath. His roommate had long since left the room, mumbling that these speeches never changed anything. But Idris Karim stayed. Eyes locked, back rigid, face pulled into a quiet scowl of disbelief and awe. He had never seen a president speak like this. Not at the UN, not at the AU, certainly not from Nigeria. He watched Traoré talk about Halima, the boy with the rock, Sankara's unfinished dream. He watched him stand alone without apology, a leader without shame, a soldier without a leash. And somewhere in the middle of it, Idris Karim felt something burning beneath his ribs. Not anger, not envy, just a deep, aching recognition. By the time Traoré spoke the words, "We are not X anything anymore," Idris Karim couldn't stay silent. He turned his camera on, just his face. No filter, no edit. Sweat still on his brow, eyes still carrying the last echoes of what he had just witnessed. His voice was low at first, but it rose with every sentence. "President Bola Ahmed Tinubu does not speak for all Nigerians," he said, his accent crisp and unmistakable. "He does not speak for the youth who are tired of being used as numbers during elections and forgotten the day after. He does not speak for those of us who still walk through flood water to get to class, who wait years for jobs that never come, who know what hunger feels like, not because of war, but because of waste." He exhaled, but didn't stop. Traoré doesn't belong to Burkina Faso alone. He belongs to a generation that is tired of watching our elders bow to the same hands that once chained them. He is saying what we whisper to each other in dorm rooms, in taxis, on street corners. He leaned closer to the lens. He's fighting what we wish we had the courage to challenge. And in that moment, a question hung unspoken in the air. If a leader's courage reflects the will of his people, what does it mean when the people have been silent too long? The video was 72 seconds long. He posted it without thinking. No tags, no caption, just raw frustration wrapped in clarity. He turned off his phone and walked to the open window to cool off. Outside, boys played football in a sandy lot. A preacher on a nearby street corner shouted into a megaphone about repentance. Life went on. He didn't know that within the hour, his video would cross 200,000 views. By midnight, it would hit 4 million, and by dawn, it would become the most shared student-recorded political message in Nigeria's digital history. It started first among students. University WhatsApp groups, Telegram channels, Signal threads. "Have you seen this guy from Unilag?" they said. Finally, someone said it. Then it moved to artists, musicians, poets. A spoken word remix of his monologue was already on SoundCloud. A TikTok duet was stitched with images of oil spills, protests, and Traoré standing at the podium. But the real shock came when it began to cross class lines. Sons of politicians began sharing it privately. A Lagos entrepreneur reposted it with the caption, "The youth are no longer silent. Watch this twice." A retired general's daughter tweeted it with one word: respect. Even in Abuja, behind marble walls and armed security, the message could not be blocked. Someone from inside the presidency shared it to a WhatsApp group filled with campaign strategists. An advisor forwarded it to Tinubu's senior communications officer with the note, "Sir, we may have a fire on our hands." On the other side of the continent, in Ouagadougou, Traoré's team caught wind of the video almost instantly. One aide brought it to him on a tablet. He watched it in silence. When the boy said, "He's fighting what we wish we had the courage to challenge, isn't he?" Traoré nodded once and handed the tablet back. "He already has the courage, you know," he said. "He just needed to hear it in someone else's voice first." But the impact wasn't limited to politics. Could it ever be just politics in Africa's current storm? It was spiritual. Churches referenced the video during youth sermons. A pastor in Benin City declared, "Even a stone will speak. If our leaders do not, can you imagine that? This boy, he is a stone." A mosque in Kano played the audio clip after Friday prayers. "This is not rebellion," the imam said. "This is remembering, but remembering what exactly?" In the streets, it became more than a clip. It became a symbol. Murals popped up overnight in Lagos and Ibadan. One depicted Idris Karim's face beside Traoré's with the words, "Dare to defend the future." But whose future do we mean? A rally was planned within 48 hours. Not for a party, not for a protest, but for unity. They called it the listening. Thousands showed up just to hear the speech again. No music, no slogans, just the truth on a loudspeaker. And somewhere in all of that noise, Idris Karim walked quietly through the crowd, head lowered, hoodie up, not to be recognized, but to listen. Because he too now understood that voice was never just his. It had always belonged to the millions who had waited in silence to finally speak. They had come prepared to listen politely, offer firm handshakes, and issue boilerplate statements about cooperation. That was how these summits typically worked. Scripts, smiles, soft diplomacy wrapped in hard economic terms. But now, Western leaders sat in unspoken stillness, each perhaps wondering, had history just shifted right under their feet? Their carefully arranged postures began to unravel under the weight of a moment no one had rehearsed for. The hall was quiet, not the respectful kind, not the kind that follows protocol. It was the kind of silence that comes when history throws a curveball and the old rules no longer fit the script. Western diplomats exchanged glances, some searching for cues, others simply staring blankly at the man who had just redefined the stage without permission. Ibrahim Traoré had not made a scene. He had made a stand. And in doing so, he'd forced the room to confront everything it had grown comfortable forgetting. The US Secretary of State crossed her legs and looked toward her aide, who offered nothing but a tight-lipped shrug. The French envoy, seated 3 rows up, ran his fingers down his tie and reached for the speech he had planned to give. He set it down without opening it. Germany's representative leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. The only movement a slight clench of the jaw. None of them applauded. None of them countered. There were no interruptions, no follow-up questions, no elegant dismissals, because they couldn't find a single word to flatten what had just been spoken. A BBC journalist, seated behind a tangle of camera cables, leaned forward and whispered to no one in particular. We just watched Africa refuse to bow. And what happens now? The words weren't meant for broadcast, but they carried anyway. A producer beside her nodded, still staring at the monitor. He didn't just speak, he murmured softly. He dismantled the whole performance. In the press gallery, fingers hovered over keyboards, hesitating. The usual framing wasn't working. There were no sound bites that could be safely lifted without risking distortion. No clear villain, no diplomatic win. Just the raw, stubborn presence of a man who had drawn a line in the sand with his voice. CNN's Africa correspondent sat still, blinking. "Do we call this a walkout?" her assistant asked. "No," she said. There was no walkout, only a freeze. Back near the center of the room, a Canadian delegate looked down at his briefing notes. Trade, climate, cooperation, investment flow. None of it applied anymore. Not in this room. Not in this hour. The words on his paper were suddenly empty. How do you negotiate with someone who already told you that dignity wasn't for sale? The silence continued to stretch, a kind of diplomatic void. But within it, something profound was taking shape. Something irreversible. Not because of what Traoré had taken from the summit, but because of what he refused to take. Validation. Applause. Agreement. He didn't need it. He had made it clear his leadership was not built on their approval. The Spanish representative finally leaned over to her Belgian counterpart and whispered, "He didn't come here to be liked. He came to be heard." "Did we hear him?" the Belgian asked. She didn't answer. At the back of the room, where translators sat in glass booths, one young interpreter pulled off her headset and sat still. She had translated Traoré's words into 5 languages. But now she sat in her own silence, overwhelmed, not by difficulty but by meaning. They always talk to us. But today, someone spoke for us, she whispered. Still no applause. Still no rebuttal. The IMF representative checked his watch, then slowly set it on the table, as if time itself had become irrelevant. Nothing could move forward. Not yet. Not while the room was still echoing with the voice that had just declared, without compromise, that African sovereignty was not a concept. It was a boundary. There was nothing left to clarify, no policy to walk back. Traoré had not accused them. He had not insulted them. He had done something far more dangerous. He had told the truth. And truth in a room built on negotiations, contracts, and optics was harder to answer than any insult could ever be. Outside the summit chamber, social media feeds in Europe and North America began filling with subtitled clips, not from news outlets, but from personal accounts. Young Africans abroad reposted Traoré's speech with captions like, "This is what our parents prayed for." Caribbean and Latin American youth picked up the thread. He speaks for all post-colonial nations. The silence inside the chamber was being met with thunder outside of it. One French broadcaster finally turned to his camera, eyes steady. "We were expecting a summit," he said. "We received a reckoning." Inside, the silence held. Not because there was nothing to say, but because for once, Africa had spoken louder, and the world, for the first time in a long time, was not ready with a reply. Traoré's hand moved slowly, deliberately, as he reached into his inner jacket pocket and withdrew a single cream-colored envelope. It was unmarked. No country seal, no title, just a faint watermark barely visible under the lights. He walked back to the podium and placed it carefully at the center, next to the crumpled resignation letter and the boy's stone that still lay there like silent witnesses. The room, still holding its breath from the speech that had just finished, now shifted again. Chairs creaked, heads tilted, eyes narrowed. "This," Traoré said softly, "is not a speech. It is a proposal." His voice had lost none of its calm. If anything, it had grown quieter, more certain, as though he wasn't merely addressing a summit, but summoning a future that had been postponed for generations. It is not meant for applause or negotiation. It is not a press release or a gesture of goodwill. It is a blueprint. He looked across the chamber where ministers and delegates leaned forward, instincts telling them something irreversible was about to be placed on the table. "Africa," he said, "has begged for partnership. We have written plans funded by foreign signatures, signed deals brokered by interests far from our people's needs. We have waited, watched, accepted crumbs labeled as aid, and now we offer something else." His fingertips tapped once on the envelope. Inside is a document co-authored by a coalition of engineers, security experts, energy economists, and community leaders across 7 nations. It outlines a continental strategy to build our own energy and defense network, not with foreign consultants, not through IMF funding, but through African cooperation, land contributions, and sovereign backing. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the hall. Someone in the media row dropped a pen. Delegates exchanged quick glances. Was this the moment Africa would stop negotiating its worth and start setting its own price? The phrase, defense and energy network, triggered every regional memory of intervention, sabotage, and silencing. Yet Traoré's face held no aggression, no threat, just an offer. "It is not perfect," he continued, "but it is possible. And more importantly, it is ours." He paused, then looked directly at President Tinubu, whose expression was unreadable, lips pursed, hands folded on the table. "You asked me to step down," Traoré said. "But I will not. I won't step away from my people's needs. I won't abandon what we've built. Can a leader claim peace if it means kneeling before the same hands that once chained his people? I won't make my country kneel again just to appear civil." He placed his hand over the envelope. "I won't resign," he said clearly, "but I will invite." The words hit harder than any demand. They offered no compromise, but extended a hand not to the IMF, not to Washington or Brussels, but to the very countries seated in the same room. The audience didn't expect that. They were prepared for refusal, not invitation. Prepared for resistance, not collaboration. But now, Traoré had reframed the entire summit. The question was no longer whether he would stay or go. It was, who else was willing to stand with him? Gasps broke the silence again. Not loud, but unmistakable. The kind that comes when people realize history isn't something you read about later. It's something that just walked into the room and sat down beside them. The South African deputy minister leaned toward his delegation and whispered, "Is this real?" The delegate from Uganda blinked rapidly, then nodded. "He's daring us to act." Back in the press booth, producers scrambled to contact editors. This wasn't just a soundbite anymore. It was a policy bombshell. On stage, Traoré didn't move to open the envelope. He left it sealed. The message was clear. The words inside were not for theatre. They were for those who were ready. "We speak often of unity," he said, But unity is not built in applause. It is built in plans, in tools, in electricity that reaches the village, in borders that defend children, not just minerals. He gestured lightly toward the European and IMF delegates seated stiffly in the front row. You have invested in our silence for decades. Now we invest in our voice. If that unsettles your forecasts, adjust them. Still no rebuttal, just stares. Was the hesitation in that silence fear of change or fear of losing control? The world may not be ready, he said finally, but Africa must be. Then, with both hands, he stepped back from the podium. The envelope remained behind, sealed, silent, but louder than anything spoken that day. Its weight was heavier than any document that had ever passed through the IMF's doors. Traoré had stepped back. His message was delivered not with thunder, but with clarity. And for a moment, it seemed the room itself didn't know how to breathe. From the left side of the chamber, near the rear, where the youth delegates from across Africa had been seated silently throughout the summit, a single chair scraped against the polished floor. A young woman from Malawi stood, barely in her 20s. No nameplate, no entourage, just a white notepad in her hand, the ink of her notes smudged from clutching it too tightly. She clapped once, then twice. Then with growing rhythm, her eyes never leaving the stage. Next to her, a delegate from Ghana rose, then one from Madagascar, another from Sierra Leone. And then, without instruction, without protocol, without a single cue from the organizers, every youth delegate in the chamber stood, one by one. Then all at once, they clapped. Not like at the end of a polite speech. This was not applause for delivery or rhetoric. This was release, reverence, recognition. Some cried openly, others stood motionless, hands pressed together as if afraid that any other movement might break what they were witnessing. Was this the first time many of them had seen their own demands spoken without dilution? Their faces carried a mixture of pride and disbelief. Like people who had spent their lives hearing their dreams were too loud, only to finally hear them spoken aloud by someone unafraid to stay standing. Traoré remained at the front of the room. He didn't smile. He didn't bow. He simply lowered his head just slightly. A nod. A gesture not of gratitude, but of solidarity. It was enough. From the press gallery, cameras continued rolling, but not all feeds made it to the air. CNN's live broadcast flickered briefly, then shifted to a soft-spoken anchor summarizing the day's economic highlights. Reuters cut to footage of dignitaries arriving earlier that morning. Across several European networks, the screen faded to blue and displayed the message, "We'll return shortly." Inside the room, the ovation grew. A German diplomat looked over at his aide. "Why are they standing?" he asked. The aide didn't answer. She was too focused on the sound that filled the room. Not just the clapping, but the undercurrent beneath it, a generation rising without permission. The IMF chair quietly gathered her notes and avoided eye contact with the African bloc. A French minister tapped her phone in frustration, trying to refresh a live feed that had stopped playing. But the applause kept rising, as if untouched by the cameras that had turned away, because this was not a performance. This was a remembering. A young delegate from Liberia stepped forward, his hands shaking. He had never spoken in front of such a crowd, but today his voice rose above the applause. "We were told to wait our turn," he said, "but it seems that waiting is no longer leadership." A few heads turned. He didn't falter. What Traoré just did, he didn't just speak for Burkina Faso. He spoke for every youth whose voice was reduced to a footnote in someone else's strategy. More applause. A Ugandan woman in a bright yellow dress lifted her hand, voice trembling with conviction. "For the first time in my life," she said, "I believe sovereignty isn't a myth. I believe we can build what they said we couldn't." Some of the elder delegates watched in stunned silence. Others looked quietly ashamed. From a corner seat, an elderly AU advisor wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. "I haven't felt this since Sankara," she whispered, "and even he didn't make them rise like this." Still, the cameras kept cutting away. The broadcasters chose silence. But was it because they feared the truth, or because they couldn't frame it? In the press box, a young freelancer from Nairobi turned on her own camera and whispered into her mic, "They won't show this, so I will." Traoré remained still, not basking, just present, just there. A man who had refused to kneel, and in doing so gave others permission to rise. Then slowly, like a wave receding back into the sea, the applause softened. Not because the energy faded, but because they had said what needed saying, without words. One by one, the youth delegates sat back down, their eyes brighter, their shoulders taller. No fanfare, no anthem, no press release. But something had shifted in the room, not declared, but undeniable. And in the quiet that followed, the envelope remained on the podium, unread, unopened, but no longer unnoticed. It wasn't on the official recap, not in the press releases, not on the live stream. The broadcast had already cut away, returning to sterile headlines and well-lit anchors summarizing constructive dialogue between African leaders. But the real story, the one that no media outlet was authorized to show, emerged through shaky phone footage, whispers between staffers, and blurry leaks captured by interns who knew history when they saw it. The footage began appearing online just after midnight. No one claimed credit, no logos, no timestamps, just a handheld angle from the far side of the summit chamber. It showed President Tinubu rising from his chair moments after Traoré stepped away from the podium. He didn't applaud, he didn't turn, he simply stood, collected his papers and walked out. No eye contact, no handshake, not with Traoré, not with any of the youth delegates now whispering in clusters. His security detail followed swiftly behind, clearing a quiet path through the back aisle. His gait was steady but stiff, measured, deliberate. The kind of walk that signaled control to an audience that had already moved on. The video cut to Traoré standing near the edge of the stage, surrounded not by presidents or cameras, but by people most media would never name. Alina Shilongo, a Namibian civil engineer, her white headscarf neatly tucked beneath her hard hat badge, reached out her hand. Traoré took it without hesitation. They didn't speak at first, just a silent exchange of respect between two builders, one of infrastructure, the other of courage. Beside her, Noura El-Bashir, a Sudanese teacher, stepped forward, her lanyard still swinging from the rush to reach him before security ended the moment. "I brought letters," she said, her voice shaking, "from my students. They watched you. They asked me to tell you we don't feel small anymore." Traoré held the envelope she gave him with both hands. "Tell them," he said, "I felt the same way standing here." There was no red carpet, no music, no formal exit. The cameras that had followed every other dignitary's arrival now sat dormant, their operators distracted, their directors uninterested. But this gathering, unfilmed, unplanned, carried more weight than any televised panel. Wasn't this the kind of moment that rewrote a continent's memory without waiting for permission? An intern from Botswana, no older than 19, slipped into the crowd with a microphone clipped to his backpack. He captured snippets of conversation. No one was boasting, no one was performing, they were processing. "He changed something today," one youth delegate said. "No," her friend corrected, "he reminded us we already had it." Meanwhile, the corridor outside the chamber echoed with hurried footsteps and murmurs behind closed doors. Several Western officials held impromptu briefings with their aides. The term damage control was spoken more than once, but how do you control what has already been set free? There was no controlling what had happened, not anymore, because what the cameras missed, the people didn't. In the hours that followed, edited versions of the summit flooded state networks across Europe and North America. They showed smiling handshakes, filtered sound bites, a conference that looked like progress. Traoré's speech was shortened to 30 seconds. His proposal was called an aspirational idea. The ovation, not shown. But the unofficial clips told another story, and that story moved faster. It reached WhatsApp groups in Soweto, in Dar, in Cairo. It played in cafes in Nairobi, was projected on walls in Kinshasa, was broadcast from speakers in Accra. They saw Tinubu walk out without a word. They saw Traoré shake hands with engineers and teachers. They saw that leadership did not require permission, and dignity did not need a spotlight. A still image began circulating. Traoré leaning forward, listening intently as a young man from Burkina Faso's rural cooperative whispered something in his ear. The caption read, "He listened like he had no title." That image became more powerful than any press release. In private circles, diplomats began rewriting their reports. One EU official scribbled in the margin of her typed notes, "May need to reassess regional influence in West Africa. Trier, not as fringe as assumed." In a room near the summit exit, a group of journalists reviewed their footage. A young producer tapped the edge of her laptop and said, "We missed it." The real moment happened after the mic was off. But can the essence of leadership ever be captured only when the cameras are on? The people hadn't missed it. They saw Traoré remain until the last handshake was given. They saw him walk down the steps alone, not escorted, not flanked. Just walking like any other man who had something to say, and had finally been heard. He didn't leave with applause ringing in his ears. He left with a quiet that meant more. It was the kind of quiet that follows truth, the kind that lingers long after the cameras have stopped rolling. The photo didn't come from a professional lens. It wasn't staged. No press team approved it, and no headline was attached. It came from the phone of a Senegalese volunteer who had stepped outside for air and glanced over at the stone stairs that led down from the back entrance of the summit building. There, seated alone in the late afternoon sun, was Captain Ibrahim Traoré. No security, no crowd, just him in his dark olive jacket, legs bent, forearms resting on his knees, and in his hands a crumpled letter. The photo was taken just as he leaned slightly forward, eyes fixed on the page. The light caught the edges of the letter, but the words were still legible, written in pencil, uneven and faint. At the top, "Don't go, Captain, we still need you." The volunteer didn't know who the letter was from, but she recognized something in the way he held it. Not like paper, but like memory. She posted the photo to X with a caption that read, "No motorcade, no soundbite. Just a man reading a letter from home." Within 10 minutes, the post had 100,000 views. Within 2 hours, it had crossed 10 million. By the end of the night, it had been shared over 20 million times across every platform imaginable. What made it spread wasn't just the visual, it was what people read between the lines. They saw the leader of a nation who had just stood against the most powerful institutions in the world, sitting not in a limousine or behind a podium, but on stairs, like a student after class, holding the words of a child as if they were sacred. Can an image speak louder than 1,000 speeches when the world already knows the weight behind it? Journalists who had ignored the full context of his speech began reposting the image, unable to deny the gravity it carried. Celebrities, poets, athletes, even retired political figures, from Latin America to Southeast Asia, began quoting the line from the letter, "Don't go, Captain." Some made art from it, others remixed it into music. One sculptor in Kenya began molding the image into bronze. A choir in South Africa wrote an a cappella rendition using only those 4 words as lyrics. But back in Ouagadougou, the source of the letter was much simpler. It had been handed to one of Traoré's aides 2 days before the summit by a group of schoolchildren from a village on the edge of the Sahel. Most of the letters had colourful drawings and crooked handwriting, but one stood out. Just 4 lines written by a girl named Yasmina, age 9. She had lost her brother to a militant raid. Her school had been rebuilt with government help. She had never met Traoré, but she had seen him once on a dusty television screen and asked her teacher, if he goes away, who will protect the other schools? The teacher hadn't answered, so she wrote her own answer. "Don't go, Captain. We still need you. I will be strong like you. I promise. Please don't stop." The rest of the page was blank, but it didn't need more. Traoré had tucked that letter into his pocket on the day of the summit. Not because it was strategy, but because it was truth. And now the world was looking at it. The hashtag #Don'tGoCaptain began trending in over 30 countries. In France, it overtook presidential coverage. In the UK, it was featured in evening broadcasts despite not being sanctioned by any wire agency. Across the Caribbean, muralists started painting the words onto school walls. But perhaps the most important reaction came quietly, without fanfare, from inside African homes. In Bamako, a grandmother showed the image to her grandson and said, "This is why we survive." In Kinshasa, a woman who had never voted said, "I trust no one, but this I believe." In Nairobi, a father pointed to the screen and told his daughter, when they ask what a leader looks like, show them this. And in a small house in Ouagadougou, not far from where Yasmina lived, her teacher printed out the image and taped it to the blackboard. The children sat quietly, some recognizing their handwriting, others whispering, "That's her letter. That's really it." Yasmina didn't say much. She just looked at the screen and said, "He read it." Back on the global stage, no one could spin the photo. There were no sound bites to reframe, no camera angles to manipulate. It was just a man and a letter, the kind of image that history doesn't fabricate but captures once. And in that stillness, Traoré had once again said everything without speaking a single word. Final scene. The screen fades in from black. Dust blows gently over red earth as the sun rises across the hills of rural Burkina Faso. There are no crowds with signs, no chants, no cameras. Just people, young and old, gathered with their hands in the soil. Women dig trenches for pipes. Men lift bricks. Children carry seedlings in cloth bundles, placing them in freshly dug holes near water tanks being installed. Laughter echoes across the villages. Not loud, but steady. It is not celebration, it is restoration. In one village, a teenage boy kneels by a shallow pit, fitting PVC pipes into place with care. He looks up at his mother and says, "It's for Halima, so she won't have to walk so far anymore." She doesn't reply, but simply presses her hand to her chest. In another place, a group of students gather around a map pinned to a wooden frame. It displays planned sites for community gardens, solar panels, and a school. Their teacher smiles gently. "This was never really about the summit, was it?" she says quietly. "It was about whether hope would endure beyond it." The camera pans slowly over scenes of quiet action, not the clatter of revolution, but the steady rhythm of intention. Young trees planted one by one, a fresh chalkboard lifted onto a mud brick wall, a farmer kneeling beside his young son, showing him how to plant millet. Then a voiceover begins, low, steady, as if rising from the very soil beneath their feet. They expected applause. Instead, they received something deeper. Africa did not clap. Africa did not cheer. Africa stood. And in standing, it spoke without uttering a word. The screen shows a young girl pushing a wheelbarrow heavy with water containers, her bare feet dusted with earth, her eyes alight with determination. While others counted power in contracts and cameras, power here was measured in courage, quiet defiance, and a dignity no tally could capture. In every well dug without permission, every home built without loans, every seed sown without a promise of rain. The camera cuts briefly to a wall in Boba Dolasso where 4 words have been painted in white. "We still need you, but do we truly grasp how much we need one another?" The voice continues. "We were told to wait. We were told to kneel. But we remembered something older than policy, stronger than fear. We remembered how to stand." The final shot. Ibrahim Traoré back in Burkina Faso. No podium, no uniform. He walks across a village field with a boy holding a shovel. They pause. The boy points to a tree already growing. Traoré kneels beside him, offering a faint smile, planting another. The earth closes over the roots as though sealing a promise. Fade to black. The voiceover ends with a whisper. "They asked us for silence. We answered with roots, and roots do not loosen their hold." And now, as we reflect on this story, what is it that lingers with us long after the final scene? Could the actions of Traoré truly become a guiding light? A beacon that future generations might look to with hope and determination? Across the vast landscapes from Dakar all the way to Nairobi are the people of Africa quietly reigniting a flame of hope, steady and unyielding, one that has weathered storms but never fully been extinguished. And what of those living far from the continent, scattered across distant shores, carrying with them lives rich with memory, history, and resilience? Might their hearts, too, feel a deeper stirring, a renewed sense of pride and connection, as they witness their homeland rise once more, not with noise and fanfare, but with steadfast courage and quiet dignity? If you hold faith in the strength of Africa's spirit, If you believe in the bravery and vision embodied by Traoré, we invite you to leave a simple message below. Proud Africa. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Help this story reach more hearts and continue to inspire others far and wide. And don't forget to watch the next video, where we explore what unfolded after that defining moment as the journey continued. Thank you for joining us on this path. Until we meet again.